All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see a lot of people in the chat already. That's going to be really important for this conversation because I plan for this to be pretty interactive or pretty engaging. So, keep that energy up within the chat. Um, I'm talking, I haven't introduced myself. My name is Derrick Lathan. I am the Prevention Director at STAR, which stands for Sexual Trauma Awareness and Response. I'll give a little more information about STAR in a second. I'm actually the outgoing prevention director for STAR. Week will be my last week. So I'm sad to go, but I'm also happy to go out with a bang by being able to present at the I Care Summit. So I appreciate all of y'all for joining and, helping me, get this last hoorah per se. So I'll start sharing my screen and then we'll get everything started. I just wanted y'all to see my face for a second. All right. So today, our session is called Sexual Trauma 101. And it's all about understanding like the foundational things about sexual assault and understanding how trauma works. Right. So I do want to go through a couple things. First, kind of get this legal jargon out of the way. Um, And then I said that I would talk a little more about STAR. So STAR's mission is to support survivors of sexual trauma, improve systems response, and create social change to end sexual violence. So at STAR, we provide free counseling services, advocacy services, and legal services to survivors of sexual assault. And we also provide those services to their loved ones because, they could be experiencing trauma as well. So we are really engaged with the community in that way, and we do a lot of prevention education, like what I'm doing today, talking about sexual trauma 101. All right. So before we get started, I do want to kind of give a disclaimer. You're going to hear some things today that you may already be familiar with and other information that may be new to you. Because we know that sexual trauma affects everyone directly or indirectly, we also recognize that many of you will have a reaction to this information. So we want to give you a trigger warning because learning about the dynamics of sexual trauma can evoke a range of emotions and will have an impact on you at some point, whether today or sometime in the future. So if you find that the information is overwhelming or triggering at any time, please feel free to check out or even log off if necessary. I will be available for a second after the presentation if you like to check in or ask any questions. All right. So I said that it was important for y'all to, keep the same energy within the chat because I'm going to start with a series of questions. All right. So first, I want y'all to respond within the chat. What is sexual violence? Usually, the first response to this question is rape, but sexual violence includes a lot more than that. Um, so I would like to know, how would y'all define sexual violence? And I'll give y'all a few moments to be able to respond to that. What is sexual violence? Okay. I'm saying assault that is sexually motivating. See, no means no. No means no is really important. And I'll come to that in a second. I want to see a couple more definitions. But no means no is really important. Okay, we got sexual abuse, behavior perpetrated upon someone without their consent, violation imposed upon someone without consent, exposure, touching, rape. Okay, it's all good stuff. So I said that I wanted to come back to consent. Um, so we throw that word around a lot, but a lot of times people don't really understand or they aren't familiar with the conditions that have to be met for something to be seen as consensual. Okay, so we know consent is a mutual agreement to participate in an activity. We're talking In this case, we're talking about sexual activity, but there are conditions that need to be met in order for something to be seen as consensual. So first, clearly things have to be mutual, right? So there has to be some sense of mutuality between all parties involved. All parties must be of age, right? So that's really important as well. All parties must be conscious and aware, right? So that means that they can't be intoxicated, they can't be any form of mental impairment at all. So far we have it has to be mutual, everyone has to be of age, and everyone has to be conscious and aware. Fourth, there has to be safety of choice, right? So that means there's no threat of violence, and the person has the ability to say no. All right. So again, no means no. If you don't give them the option to say no, then that's not really consensual. Okay. The last two things are trust and respect for sexual boundaries and communication about those sexual boundaries. Okay. So in order for something to be consensual, it has to be mutual. Everyone has to be of age. Everyone has to be conscious and aware. There has to be safety of choice. And when we talk about sexual boundaries, there has to be communication about those sexual boundaries, and there has to be trust and respect for those boundaries. So you have to trust that this person will respect your boundaries, and you have to then respect said boundaries, right? So all of those things have to be met when we're talking about consent. So when we're talking with adults or we're talking with youth, we want to make sure that they understand all of the things that have to take place in order for something to be consensual. All right. So I have a few more questions that I want to ask. All right. So who commits sexual violence? Right. So this isn't a trick question. Um, we typically have stereotypes of who could be a perpetrator and who isn't. So that's why I'm asking that question. Who commits sexual violence? Okay. The very first comment I saw was anyone. And I like that response. So I'm going with it. So we see family, friends, strangers, anyone. All right. So it's really important that we keep that in mind. Like I said, we have stereotypes about who could be a perpetrator and who isn't. Right. So we often think of some boogie person or a stranger that commits acts of sexual violence, but that isn't how it usually plays out. It happens, but you'll see later on in the presentation that there are other factors and actors that we have to be aware of. Right. Next, um, so do perpetrators sometimes find support within our communities? Do perpetrators sometimes find support within our communities? Again, it's not a trick question. Okay, I see yes. Okay, so I would hope we all would want to say no. However, think about spaces where people sometimes turn a blind eye to acts of aggression or violence. So think about locker rooms, bars, or clubs, or instances where we just say I want to mind my business, right? And so there may not be any bystander intervention taking place. Or think about conversations that place blame on victims rather than perpetrators. So we usually see victim blaming when there's alcohol involved, or somebody's blaming what someone is wearing, or we assume that because somebody is a celebrity or because they're rich, they don't have to quote unquote assault someone, right? Or think about places where we think violence is inescapable or expected, like how we kind of just brush away sexual assault within prisons, right? So of course we want to say people don't find support within our communities, perpetrators don't find support within our communities, but there are places where we may ignore, excuse, or dismiss acts of aggression or acts of violence, right? And so these are things that we want to think about as well. Right. And my last question for now is what does the media teach us about sexual violence? What does the media teach us about sexual violence? What does the media teach us about sexual violence? I think we learn a lot from the things that we consume, things we read, things we see, things we hear. Okay. So, so I, in particular, when I think about what the media teaches us about sexual violence, the very first thing that kind of comes to mind is how we frame romance sometimes. Sometimes we frame romance in weird ways. So in the media, we may see actors downplay or skip the importance of consent, as if like that's not important enough to get to, or they may skip over consent altogether. We may only see one type of person be portrayed as a victim, while another person does not get that same regard, right? So we've seen a person's past, their racial identity, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomic status, or the intersection of all of these things, be used to paint them as a victim or not. We've also seen media outlets heavily cover one type of story while staying away from others. So news stories, headlines, and social media posts all influence how we see and interpret sexual assault. So whether we think it is pervasive or not can be dependent on how the media covers it. It can make us think that it's less pervasive or that it's not happening as much just because we don't see it in the media. So if you don't see it, you may not think about it, right? And so media plays an important role in how we interpret sexual assault and how we respond to it, right? So let's keep that in mind as well. So I asked y'all what was sexual violence, and I have a couple bullet points for that. So in sexual activity where consent is not granted or freely given, a non-legal umbrella term that encompasses all forms of sexual violence from harassment to rape. I should have bolded from harassment to rape because that's something that we'll come to in the next slide. Okay. Nearly 1 in 2 women and 1 in 5 men have experienced sexual violence victimization other than rape at some point in their lives. Right. So this is coming from the CDC. So I said that I should have bolded it because sexual violence is a continuum, right? So like I said before, some of our first thoughts are rape because that's one of the most gruesome acts that a human could do. But sexual violence exists on a continuum. So you can see in this top row where it talks about behavior. On the far left, we see non-consensual sexual comments or jokes, right? Then it goes up a level. We see flashing, public masturbation, then peeping, harassing calls or texts or emails, touching, fondling, groping, or grabbing. You can see it, escalating as you go further to the right. So we're talking about harassment on one end, then obscenity, voyeurism, stalking, cyber stalking, sexual battery, rape or attempted rape, and then you have sex trafficking all the way on the other end of the spectrum. And these things have negative impacts on survivors, right? So survivors can end up feeling silent, violated, frustrated, overwhelmed, powerless, unsafe, all these things. And so the impacts of sexual violence don't just stay at the individual level. So a lot of times we think about that way, but sexual violence impacts communities and it impacts institutions, right? So if we don't respond to sexual violence in the right way, communities can end up not teaching people about sex in healthy ways. They may view sex as taboo or shameful. They may tolerate sexual entitlement and boundary violating behaviors, right? Or when we talk about institutions, they may not have comprehensive systems to address sexual violence, or they may lack policies to hold perpetrators accountable. So when we think about sexual violence, we want to think about it beyond the individual level as well. So keep the individual level in mind, but it also goes beyond that. Right? So I'll just read the second bullet. And let me know if y'all are having. I see a couple people ask about audio, so I'll try to speak up a little louder. But so the second bullet says falling under the definition of sexual assault are forced sexual intercourse, forcible sodomy, child molestation, incest, fondling, and attempted rape. So these are things that we saw along that continuum as well. Right. And so with we go through that continuum just to kind of expand people's perspective. If we don't see things as sexual violence, then we won't respond to it properly. So it's important to have an expanded understanding of sexual violence so you can see how pervasive it actually is. So the data points that I'm showing right now also come from the CDC. It says that there are 237,868 victims of rape and sexual assault each year in the US. So that's one sexual assault every 2 minutes. Right? So this is more data, explaining rape. And so it says 1 in 5 women will experience rape in their lifetime. 1 in 71 men will experience rape in their lifetime. 1 in 21 men will be made to penetrate someone in their lifetime. Okay. So the made to penetrate someone survey response, most men said that it was an intimate partner or an acquaintance that made them do it. Right. So again, we come back to these ideas of who we think are committing these acts of sexual violence. We think it may be a stranger, but it can be somebody that you know. Right. And so in these next couple slides, I'll refer to data that we've collected ourselves as STAR, specifically in our New Orleans office. So again, this is for our New Orleans office. We have an office in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and in Alexandria. So, but this is in Baton Rouge, but it is something to pay attention to given how closely our communities are. It's also worthwhile to see what these numbers would look like during our pandemic years, because this data was collected between 2018 and the 2019 fiscal year. But as you can see from the graphic, males were an overwhelming majority of perpetrators. None of our clients reported being assaulted by a transgender person, unlike some of the narratives that get created about them, particularly when we talk about bathrooms. And it does reveal that 2% of perpetrators were identified as female. So again, sexual assault, though most perpetrators may be men, sexual assault knows no gender. Anybody could be a victim of sexual assault. Anyone could be a perpetrator of sexual assault. So we want to come back to that idea of checking the stereotypes we have about who commits sexual violence, who can be a victim of sexual violence. Okay. In this next slide, the data reveals the relationship or lack thereof the survivor had with the perpetrator. So as you can see, 23% reported that the perpetrator was a stranger. 12% marked that they didn't know who the perpetrator was. So the perpetrator was unknown. But as you can see, outside of that, all other acts of violence came from someone the survivor knew. Right. So we want to, again, check those stereotypes that we have. Many times, sexual violence is being committed by someone that the person trusts or that the person already has a relationship with. Right. So this may seem self-explanatory sometimes, but it is very important to iterate and reiterate that rape is not sex at all. Rape is sexual violence. It's about power, it's about control, it's about anger, and it's about hostility, right? So we want to make sure we don't conflate the two. A lot of times that's what people may do in the media, even in a lot of legal cases, they may try to conflate the two, but rape is not sex. Okay. And so this quote comes from a blog post from one of STAR's longtime employees. It speaks to some of the excuses and justifications we try to afford perpetrators at times. We don't make excuses because we're bad people, I like to say. We just never want to believe anyone we know, love, cheer for, or look up to would be capable of heinous acts of violence. However, in spite of that willingness to see good in people, we can't do a disservice to those that are survivors of these acts of sexual violence because they experience varying degrees of trauma, right? Which leads us to the next point. So we can't talk about sexual assault without talking about the impacts of sexual assault, which we refer to as trauma. Trauma could be short term or it could be long lasting for both the survivor and their loved ones, right? So again, a person may be experiencing that direct trauma and their loved ones may be experiencing vicarious trauma. And this trauma could be mental, it could be emotional, or it could be physical, right? So we also want to check the stereotypes of how we think trauma is supposed to manifest and when it's supposed to go away. All right. So I'll come back to asking y'all questions again. So the impacts? What are impacts of sexual violence on physical, sexual, and mental health? So, what are some of the physical impacts? What are some of the sexual impacts? What are some of the mental health impacts that can be caused by sexual violence? I'm checking the chat too. So I see PTSD. I'm seeing depression, anxiety. All of those are on my list. Shame. Okay. Depression. Yes. See, man, y'all know some stuff. All right. Low self-esteem, trust issues, guilt, self-hate. You know, y'all will be able to do this session because y'all know a lot. All right. I'm seeing PTSD. All right. So yeah. So PTSD is a really big one. I'm seeing lack of desiring intimate relationships. That's important as well. PTSD is a really big one. A lot of times we only attribute PTSD to like war veterans, stuff like that, but anybody can experience PTSD if they experience a traumatic event, right? So some of those impacts that I have on my list are injuries, gynecological problems, uh, STIs, unintended pregnancies, induced abortions, adverse pregnancy outcomes, depression, like how y'all was saying, and emotional distress in general, right? So all of these can stem from sexual violence, right? So my next question, what are the impacts on behavioral health? So what are some behavior changes you think may manifest from someone being sexually assaulted? What are some behavioral changes that you may see? Well, I'm messing up. I see aggression, dissociation, substance abuse, hypersexuality, withdrawn behavior, isolation. It can be socially withdrawn. Okay, good stuff. All right. So yes, uh, someone may start to abuse substances. They may have difficulty with sleeping. They may develop eating disorders, or they may be sexual risk taking. Especially depending on when the sexual assault took place, right? So if it happened at an early age, that can manifest in many different ways. And some of those like risk-taking behaviors could be, having multiple partners and unprotected sex, which could also lead, unfortunately, to a greater risk of re-victimization. So it's important to pay attention to that kind of stuff as well. All right, I kind of showed y'all already, but my last question is, what are the impacts on social and economic health? So we've been talking about mental health, physical health. We talked about behavior changes, but as we, think beyond those things, what are some impacts on social and economic health? Y'all gave some of them already, but what are those impacts on social and economic health? How can sexual assault and the trauma from sexual assault impact someone's social health and their economic health? I'm seeing trust issues. Okay. All right. They may lack trust. It may be hard to keep a job. Um, may be unable to continue working, therefore they'll lose income, decrease function in life, unable to stay in school or hold a job, unemployment and poverty, loss of income. Well, yeah, these comments coming in. Sleep patterns could be impacted, and they may have an inability to relate to peers because of the trauma. Possible impulsivity, decreased productivity within the workplace. So I say looking for love in all the wrong places, substance abuse. Yeah. So a lot of times we don't think about the economic impacts of sexual violence, but they exist, right? And we talk about like those social and economic health impacts. We have to think about the things that y'all was saying, but also isolation, decreased trust in others, like how y'all was saying, and inability to work or pursue education if they're a student, loss of wages if you can't work, you're not making money, a lack of participation in activities, and a limited ability to care for yourself or for children, right? So we are seeing all of these different impacts that stem from sexual violence. Okay? So survivors of sexual trauma are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression. They're 6 times more likely to suffer from PTSD, like I was saying, 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. And so we can see how impactful sexual violence can be on a person and on their loved ones, on their communities, on our neighborhoods, etc. So I always like to make sure we don't just talk about an issue, but we also try and figure out ways to solve said issue. So we discussed all of this, but I want us to think about what some solutions would be. And when I say solutions, I mean things that would lead to us living in a world free from sexual violence. So I think that's really, before y'all put solutions, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that it is possible to live in a world that is free of sexual violence. We just have to put the right solutions in place. A lot of times people dismiss it and say, oh, there'll always be rape, there will always be sexual violence, people will always be people, but I disbelieve that. I believe that we can exist in a world free of sexual violence. And so I ask you all, what are some solutions to make sure that world comes to pass? What are some solutions to end sexual violence? And a lot of the solutions aren't as big as we think. They could be everyday type things. All right. Access to therapy, yes. Introspection to address where urges or feelings stem from in order to heal. Good one. What else? What are some solutions? Think about everyday things that would prevent sexual assault. Education, changing the narrative around consent, conducting more conversations about the topic. Yes, sex education is important. Trauma informed care, educational preventional programs in early life, changing our attitudes about sexual violence in media, continue to bring awareness to the issues, advocate at the state level, um, educating our genders at an early age. Education is really important, especially when we're talking about prevention. Consistent awareness. All right, so having commercials, activities, sponsors, um, teaching sexual terms for from a young age, using the real names. Yes. uh, an increase in positive things. If you heal through it, solutions. Personally, like making you stronger and compassionate for other survivors. Navigating through it can make you resilient. Okay. All right. So a lot of these solutions can be twofold. So parents teaching children, that's important as well. So we have to think about prevention and response, right? So how do we prevent sexual assault from happening, and what do we do if sexual assault actually does take place? So how do we respond to it as well, right? So some of the things that are on my list, I see legislative reform. That's very important. Some of the things that are on my list are prioritizing consent, right? So that's more of an everyday type thing, and communicating and respecting sexual boundaries. So of course, consent goes beyond just sex, right? Consent could be, does somebody like being hugged or not? Does someone want to have a particular conversation? Consent is all about respecting boundaries. Everyone has their own set of boundaries. Our boundaries may align with each other, but they may not, right? So we have to be able to respect those boundaries. I see honest communication. Yes, right. So we have to have open and honest communication, and we have to provide space to be able to have that conversation, right? We want people to be honest, so we have to give them the space to be able to do so. The next thing is bystander action, right? So challenging harmful attitudes and beliefs and speaking up when we witness boundary violations or other bad situations. So when we talked about places or spaces where violence or acts of aggression may be excused or ignored, we have to challenge those acts of violence or those acts of aggression during those times. Now that doesn't mean put yourself in harm's way. A lot of times that's what we think about. So we say I'll just mind my business. You always have options, right? So whether that is you're using distractions, you're trying to delegate to someone else, you're seeking help, right? There are a bunch of options that you have when you're talking about intervening in a situation. Like y'all was saying, increasing community awareness and education, right? So taking the issue seriously, recognizing the impacts of sexual violence, and recognizing that it is possible to reduce perpetration, right? Having positive portrayals in media, showing healthy relationships. So again, I said sometimes we show romance in weird ways. Some of my favorite movies are the most toxic movies ever, and I learned some really, really bad stuff from them. So it would be helpful to have more positive portrayals, actually showing consent, right, and having conversations with people about separating fantasy from reality. So what you hear in music, what you see on TV, what you see in movies, what you read, all of that is fantasy. It is scripted in a very specific way to appeal to you. It may not be rooted in reality. Even reality TV isn't always real, right? So we have to be able to separate fantasy from reality. All right. Now, when we're talking about response, we have to hold people accountable for committing violence. Um, Not just so we try to hold people quote unquote accountable, or we blame people for experiencing violence rather than holding the people that actually committed the violence accountable. So we need to make sure we shift our thinking with that. Nobody deserves sexual assault. Nobody did anything to cause sexual assault. Someone sexually assaulted someone. So we have to hold that perpetrator accountable, right? And we also want to be supportive to survivors, right? So we never know how that trauma will manifest. We don't know how long it'll last. So we want to make sure we are supportive regardless, right? And some of those other things are, showing empathy, showing, demonstrating that golden rule. Don't do anything that you don't want someone to do to you. Act responsibly, promote access to mental health services. So, like we were talking about therapy a few moments ago, caring for others who may be vulnerable, right? And holding offenders, like I was saying, accountable and getting rehabilitation for them, right? So, all of these are things that we can do to create a world free of sexual violence. And again, holding people accountable could be that legislative reform, right? We have things on the books, but a lot of times we don't actually use them, or we don't use them to their fullest extent. I can name several cases where somebody may have been found guilty, but they were able to get off, right? So we want to make sure we hold people accountable and also provide rehabilitation. All right. So at this time, I will open things up for Q&A. I guess I'll stop sharing my screen now, so I can see. And my camera is flipped. This is so weird. If there are any questions, I'll be able to see in the chat. Okay. I see. From a counseling perspective, how do you counsel those impacted by sexual trauma? So I'm not a counselor by trade, but from what I hear from the counselors at STAR, the very first thing is to start with support and belief, right? And also being trauma informed, right? So understanding that a lot of times we just kind of want to quote unquote solve it. Like we want to get to the bottom of things, so we want people to tell us all the details and get everything out. But as a counselor, you have to understand that that may not happen. So one of the impacts of trauma is, loss of memory. You may not be able to recall things, or things may trigger you. So you may want to stay away from certain conversations. So as a counselor, being trauma informed, that's something that you want to be aware of as well. Um, and we always say, start with beliefs. So we make sure survivors feel support. This isn't going to be a place where you have to defend yourself from scrutiny. This isn't going to be a place where you have to justify your thinking or have to explain what your thinking was. We deal with what actually happened and try to help you, process what those feelings are and help you, decide what you want to do. So another part of being a counselor, being an advocate is respecting a survivor's decision making. So they may not want to file a report. They may not want to pursue legal action. And so we have to respect that. People process things in different ways, and they deal with trauma in different ways. So we also want to make sure we respect their decision making. When someone is assaulted, they are having their power stripped away from them. And so the last thing we want to do is also strip that power too, right? So we want to give them that decision making power and respect whatever decision that they come to. Do you have any resources available for elementary school counselors? Uh, sure, I can share some things with Dr. Thornton and other eye care staff. Uh, so we used to have a program called Courageous Kids. We don't really do that anymore, but Shifting Boundaries, I think, has some really good stuff that could be applicable to elementary students. So it's all about, understanding boundaries, uh, understanding what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, stuff like that. Um, hmm Yeah, so there are a lot of resources out there. Um, any other questions? I appreciate y'all for being so active in the chat too. I know sometimes uh, that could be weird to do, but I appreciate y'all.
Well, everyone, I'm sure you would join in me in thanking Mr. Lathan for this exceptional webinar about sexual violence. This information is absolutely essential for protecting and promoting the health and safety of all persons, but most especially tweens, teens, and young adults. We truly appreciate you, Mr. Lathan, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I would like to remind all participants to complete the evaluation for this session by 4:30 p.m. today. The clickable link for the evaluation can be found on the agenda. Your CEU certificates will be emailed to you in approximately 2 weeks' time. All of the sessions will be recorded for viewing later, but only the live sessions can be used for CEU credit. Please refer to the iCare website For additional bio and contact information about all of our speakers today, as well as Mr. Lathan. Thank you, professionals, for your active participation in the chat. Your knowledge and your expertise was also evident by your participation. Unless Mr. Lathan has any final comments or any other questions have come through, we will be concluding at this time. The next section will begin at 10:45. Mr. Lathan, last words?
Thank y'all.
Thank you too.
All right.
I guess we're closing now. Again, enjoy your break, complete your evaluation. The next sessions will begin promptly at 10:45. Thank you on behalf of Lori Anderson and I and the Eye Care program for participating. Have a great rest of your summit. Bye-bye.